The three things you can do with sexual energy and why pretty much everyone picks the wrong one. When it comes down to it, the emotional energy and the sexual energy that you have for relationships, there's really only three things that you can do with it. You can spend it, gamble it, or invest it. Now, in this video, obviously, I'm going to break down these three things for you, but before I do that, I have a question for you. Purely at a gut level, out of these three options right now, which do you think is the wisest option to choose? Think about it for a few seconds. Is it wiser to use your energy in relationships by spending it, gambling it, or investing it? Well, most people, when asked that question, would probably say it's wiser to invest it, and that makes sense to me. After all, when you spend something like money, you never get it back. When you gamble, you're taking a big risk, and it's hard to hold on to anything that you gamble with. Whereas with investing, not only are you holding on to it, you're going to end up with a lot more and more of it in your life. So if it's your emotional energy, your love, and your sexual energy that you are investing, you end up with more of it, more love in your life, more sex, more positive emotional energy in your relationships. It's obviously the wisest choice. But what if I told you that you'd been conned your entire life? What if I told you that you'd been tricked your entire life by society into gambling, when actually what you thought you were doing the whole time was investing? If you found out that was happening, you'd be pretty angry about it, right? Well, that's exactly what has been happening. But to understand how and why, we're going to need to break down these three things a little more. First of all, spending. An example of spending your energy in relationships is doing something like just focusing on the short-term dating market. For example, if you date and maybe start sleeping with someone and you tell them you're not really interested in dating exclusively right now, or you don't want anything serious, or you just want to be fuck buddies or friends with benefits, then you're spending. The arrangement might work for a little while, but not for long. After all, what you're basically saying to that person is, I like you enough to want to have sex with you, but not enough to want you for a boyfriend or girlfriend. Is it okay with you if we continue to have sex until I find someone that I actually really do like? Yeah, you can already see how that's going to play out. You're going to be going back to square one again pretty soon, back to hitting up those singles bars again, collecting phone numbers, and trying to get someone else out on a first date. Pretty depressing, but that's what happens when you spend. You end up with nothing, and back at square one again. Another example of spending in relationships is cheating. You will get caught eventually. When you do, back to square one again. Back to hitting up those singles bars again, collecting phone numbers, and trying to get someone else out on a first date. There was a story in the paper just the other day about this guy who left his laptop open and his Facebook logged in, and his girlfriend found messages from his other girlfriends. They all found out about each other, all dumped him, and apparently this is his usual modus operandi. To do this, start again from scratch when they find out, do the exact same thing until the next lot found out, they dump him, and he starts again from scratch until the next lot find out. Constantly spending, never investing, back to square one with nothing to show for it. By the way, if you're sitting there all smug because you've been cheating for years and years, and you've never been caught, well, you're still spending. The only difference between you and someone who gets caught a lot earlier is that it's a lot less painful for them and a lot more painful for you when the inevitable happens, because you're the one that's spending more and more months and years on the relationship and maybe even moving in together or having a kid. Obviously, it's a lot harder to just shrug your shoulders and walk away from all that when the truth comes out. Now, some people spend for different reasons, like ego or narcissism. Female groupiedom, where women chase after famous actors, musicians, and sports stars, is an example. This is mostly about narcissism. Women do this in order to prove to themselves the level of man that they can get into bed with, and they care about indulging their own narcissism far more than they care about anything else, including the guy himself, or whether the guy in question is married or has a girlfriend. Again, this is a form of spending in relationships. It almost never leads to any kind of long-term or even medium-term relationship. Back to square one again. The male ego can lead to spending too, like those pick-up artist guys who are only really interested in their notch count and have no clue how to even have a long-term relationship. When it comes to women, those guys are like dogs chasing cars. They have no clue what to do with one when they catch one. So what happens? Back to square one. Back to hitting up those singles bars again, collecting phone numbers, trying to get someone else out on the first date. The curse of the pickup artist. Okay, so I think we have a pretty good idea what I mean when I say that you can spend emotional energy in sexual relationships. So let's move on to the second option, gambling. Now, this is a really interesting one. Why? Well, because whenever you embark on what I call a conventional fenced relationship, you are gambling. When I say fenced relationship, I basically mean any relationship in which both parties agree to fence in their sexuality on an exclusive basis. So, conventional boyfriend-girlfriend or husband-wife relationships. When you agree to enter into this kind of relationship, you and your partner are both saying, I will bet you that between now and either my death or your death, whichever comes first, I will bet you that I will never have sex with another person, and neither will you. What are the stakes of this bet? The entire relationship. When you make that bet, the chances are you've already signed a death warrant on your relationship, but you just don't know it yet. Not only is that an insane bet, it is the only bet you would ever be prepared to place in your life, in which the cost of losing the bet only increases year after year after year after year, and yet at the same time, the chances of you losing the bet also increases year after year after year. That's insane! The typical pattern that you see emerge from all of this is an ever-expanding list of failed gambles that just pile up year after year. In other words, you're happy with someone, you agree to officially become a couple, and it works until it breaks down because one of you, or maybe even both of you, hop over the fence while the other one wasn't looking and got caught. Or perhaps some other reason that was actively caused by you fencing the relationship. Reasons like jealousy and possessiveness. After all, once you establish fences, well, fences need to be patrolled, don't they? Which is exactly what jealousy and possessiveness and controlling behavior is. So, people who go through their entire lives following the conventional model and have a life of serial monogamy basically just have an ever-expanding list of ex-boyfriends or ex-girlfriends behind them. Failed gambles. Now, the funny thing about gambling is that if you ask the average woman, do you like gambling, do you like sports betting, do you like gambling on the horse races or anything else, mostly they'll say no. So, if you don't like gambling with money, why on earth would you gamble with something far more valuable? With your heart? The answer to that question is something I mentioned at the beginning. People who are gambling in relationships like this are being told by society that they're actually investing, which is a pretty cruel trick. People embark on these kind of relationships because they want to invest their emotional and sexual energy in relationships. And society is lying to them and telling them that not only is this how you invest in relationships, but also that this is the only way in which you are allowed to invest in relationships. And that if you don't subscribe to this model, this way of relating, then you will be judged and stigmatized by society at large. This is why people are so angry and upset and frustrated when it comes to relationships. They have been told that they are investing, when actually all they're doing is signing up to this ridiculous Ponzi scheme which eventually comes tumbling down all around them. Before I move on from talking about gambling, it would be silly of me not to point out one other very obvious thing. People who are gambling in this way are doing the opposite of what we advise people to do who want to invest financially or in any other kind of way. A common piece of investment advice is don't put all your eggs in one basket. If you want to invest in anything, that's good advice, and the people who do want to invest usually follow it, except when it comes to relationships. After telling people their entire lives how foolish it is to put all of your eggs in one basket, society, when it comes to relationships, says, oh, you've got to put all your eggs in one basket. That's how investing your emotional energy in relationships work. Now, if you look at it this way, it's fairly easy to call bullshit when society tells us that gambling emotional energy in this way is actually investing. It's not. It's gambling. Let's stop pretending otherwise. Okay, so moving on to option number 3, investing. So, if society has been lying to us our entire lives and telling us that the gambling that we've all been doing is actually investing when it's not, what the hell does investing look like? Well, let's get one possible misconception out of the way right at the beginning, because this is important. There is nothing wrong with being with just one person and being emotionally bonded to just them and loving just them and having no interest in anyone else. There's nothing wrong with that at all. Pair bonding, yes. Coercive sexual exclusivity agreements, no. Being pair bonded and all loved up is great. Agreements whereby you fence in both your own sexuality and somebody else's at penalty of death, at least the death of the relationship. That's no way to invest at all. You're not only gambling when you're doing that, you are gambling with a gun held to the head, and there's a name for that, Russian roulette. Stop kidding yourself and telling yourself that you are investing when you're doing that. You're gambling. So the first step towards investing, as opposed to gambling, is don't enter into mutually coercive sexual exclusivity agreements ever, regardless of whether your desired number of sexual partners is one or more than one. That means just because you don't want to exercise your option of being with anyone else right now, that does not mean that a mutually agreed system of control needs to be imposed on you both. Don't do it. Don't sign that death warrant. Number 2, go in with the full intention of having this relationship for as long as possible. For years, maybe decades, and hopefully for life. As long as it continues to be mutually rewarding, the relationship should persist. Your time and emotional investment is never spent, and it's always invested for the long term. When you're able to do this successfully and skillfully, the return on the emotional effort, the love, and the sexual energy you put into relationships will be massively rewarded. Now, this brings up a bunch of questions. How do you go about doing this skillfully? How do you have the original conversation with people you meet and date? How do you stop jealousy and possessiveness getting in the way? The investment model essentially requires a different mindset, a different mentality, and a different way of going about relationships. One that society does not train you for. The good news is that I will train you. I've put together a free 4-part video training series on just that. To take a look at the first video, go to unfencedrelationships.com, and I will see you there.